It's great to be back here. I was at the Trace 3 event at the Palms, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. I've been fortunate enough to be involved with Trace 3 from the beginning. Hayes and I chatted when he was first starting the company to see what he's become and the value he's brought to so many companies. Quality of people he's employed. It's fantastic. So it is a little different what Hayes has asked me to do. Typically, I'll talk about the power of corporate culture. Most of you know NetApp just got named for the 12th straight year in the top 100 places to work in America. We're in the top 10 in 20 countries right now, number 1 in 5. So culture is a big deal to me, but he basically said, can you kind of tell us how you got the way you think, and how did this happen in your career as a leader? So I hope to do 2 things today. I'd like to take you through a very quick move through my career, but what I learned and some of the challenges, some of the mistakes I made. So hopefully if you're in any of those situations, it can help. The second thing, though, as I reflected for this, I've had the opportunity to meet people that other people just don't meet. And I've had the opportunity to work very closely with some people who are now legends. 3 particular ones. John Morgridge, the original CEO, chairman of the board of Cisco. John hired me in 1982. John's come to Notre Dame to speak for me. John and I are very, very close. I'm going to share with you what I learned from John. Don Valentine. You talk about legendary venture capitalists. Venture capital was his idea. He founded Sequoia Capital. Don was our chairman for 15 years. I raised the money with Don. Now, I was reflecting on all the things he's taught me, but perhaps you'd like to hear some of those things. He was probably the smartest guy in Silicon Valley history. Now Tom Perkins is, right? Do you believe Tom Perkins' comments the last couple of days? Disgrace to Silicon Valley, in my opinion. But anyway, and then the third piece would be Dan Warmenhoven. Dan Warmenhoven was the CEO, joined NetApp. I joined in May of '92. He joined in November, and he's now our chairman. But together, whatever you believe, if you believe NetApp has built something special, the 2 of us did it together, and I'd like to share what I learned from him. So let me go back. My leadership journey started when I was 26 years old, which at the time was considered young. Guys like Hayes have started 2 companies at that age at this point, but 26 years old when I got in a mini computer game with a company called Data General. They were known to be young, aggressive. Digital Equipment was the big company. It was very fortunate to me because prior to that, it was all mainframes. And to be in a mainframe company, to get into leadership, you probably had to be 35, 40. That's just how it was. They put you through these very long tracks. IBM, you didn't get there for a very long time. But in mini computers, a different crowd was joining it. And of course, that started a revolution that just kept going. So I was 26 years old. I was a leading salesperson. And I did not have one thought about going into leadership. In fact, it didn't hit me as a good idea. I remember saying it's like herding cats. Because I had brought in my friends. I joined a terrible office for Data General in Phoenix. They just fired it. Literally everybody for the third year in a row. And they only hired engineers to sell to engineers in the company. I was a non-engineer. The guy said to me during the interview, you know, I'd love to hire you, except you don't have an engineering degree. I said, did all those guys you fired have engineering degrees? Yeah, how'd that work for you? I'm just wondering. So he decided he would try something different, which worked out, which basically what we know is if you'll take the time to understand people's needs, if you'll take the time to listen, and then go solve those needs. They don't really care if you know how to engineer the product. So we took off, I took off, and I brought my college roommate, and I brought another guy from my college, and I brought 2 guys that worked with me in a previous company, and we took off. And then the guy who was leading it got ill. So they turned to me, the team, and they said, we'd love for you to take it over. I go, I don't want to do that. I mean, I'm having a great time, but they said, well, if you don't do it, they'll bring in someone who's going to go back to bringing in engineers, and what we're building is never going to come out. So I decided to do it, very much thinking this would be a short-term play in my career. But something happened instantaneously. The first thing is I loved being able to make an impact for people right at the point of attack. So, you know, when you're selling, you got to, at those days, you had to bring the cables and you got to bring all the stuff with you. Now, I would just show up at a client at the most important time and be able to do my thing. And I just loved it. The second thing that happened is I got to present to somebody on a stage, like a Trace 3 employee by Hayes, to give them an award. And it was like a thunderbolt because I got such a bigger rush from giving somebody a plaque than I ever got from getting one. And that's a lesson in leadership as an aside. If you don't have that feeling, I don't think you'll be a great leader. You have to get more joy out of watching others succeed than your own personal success. You should stay an individual contributor. I left Data General I've never left a company because of title or money, ever. I left because I didn't believe in the company anymore. They started to talk about bottom line, bottom line, bottom line. Everything was cuts. There was nothing about vision or where we were going. That's why I love what Hayes does. Hayes is always trying to go different. Where else can I go? So every company I've ever left, that's true. But in 1979, I met a guy named Bill Foster. He's the head of engineering of DG. I said to him, you know, these startups are starting to happen. And startups were not normal at that point. I said, if you ever do one, he'd be one of the top 2 guys at a place called Tandem. I said, I would love to do something with you. 2 years later, he calls me, and this is when I left DG, and he said, I'm starting this company called Stratus Computer. I'd like my VP of sales to come see you. This guy's named John Morgridge. So John had just been fired at Honeywell. Imagine this. John's the number 2 guy at Honeywell to this guy. This number 1 beats that guy and fires everybody, or John finishes his career at Honeywell. Today, Cisco sits on John Morgridge's way, so it worked out for him, you know what I'm saying? We all have had moments that seem real bad at the time. Later on, you're going, that's one of those. So John came out to see me, and I don't think I've ever been a better personal friend with anybody I've actually worked for. But he did a couple things for me that were absolutely critical. So I was the first sales guy on the West Coast, selling manager for a startup company in Boston. In fact, most of my early career I worked for Boston-based companies, which I found much harder. Once I worked for a Silicon Valley-based company, the way they think is a little differently and more in tune with me. But when he came out, the first 2 years was selling fault-tolerant computing. That means computers that don't fail, and you have to pay quite a bit more for them. Now, the natural market for that's financial. The natural market's a brokerage. I didn't have any of that. I had manufacturing companies, proprietary operating system. It means I had to go convince somebody to write the code into an industry and then go. Well, that wasn't going to happen fast. I made the goal my first 2 years. John was very, very supportive. But the thing that he did for me is there'd be in any startup, and I loved having been in a startup. I love being in a startup. I could never work for a big company once I was in a startup because so much depends upon you. You know, in a big company, if you don't come through, you affect a little part of the business. They were waiting for me to build the West Coast. So a couple things he taught me. One, if you're going to ask somebody to do an incredibly hard challenge, you got to stay with them. You got to invest enough to know that if they're going the right direction, you're going to stay with them. And I never felt like he was going to abandon me. And the guys in the East numbers were much higher than mine at the beginning because they had financial services. In my second or third year, we started a hit in manufacturing. Tell you a couple of the mistakes I made. And I've warned every really good sales guy, if they're going to be in leadership, they'll probably make this mistake. When I was hiring, I tried to hire people who get me close enough to get me to the deal. I didn't really care if they knew how to do the whole deal. Just get me into that room and I'll do the deal. Well, how do you think that eventually works out when you get 5, 10, 20 people? You can't scale that. And eventually you realize you need to have people who can do the entire deal. And I changed my hiring model because I said, I got to get somebody that an executive will respect. I can add value, but I can't be the value. Almost all of us have made that mistake at some time. When you're talented at something, you try to figure out how to help them. They've got to learn it. So I changed my hiring model. I started to move up. I ended up running vice president of half the country, but something happened there that affected my thinking, and it's one of the core things that made NetApp's culture the way it is. 1984, the year before, I had visited Hawaii. First time. I went to Kauai. I think this is the most beautiful place I've ever been in my life. So I come back, and I had made club 2 years ago, and in tech, they have these things called clubs. And I convinced the company they should have the next year's club in Kauai at the Mauna Lani, which was just opening up. And I was so excited until I missed club. So what happened is I had these 3 or 4 monster deals: Hughes Aircraft, Northrop, TRW, McDonnell Douglas, monster firms who we had never done business with. I had one guy develop software, and we're going to nail all 4, which eventually made my career there because they all came down. But they didn't come down when I needed them to. Everybody in sales knows that feeling, especially when you're stuck in procurement. There's nothing about decision, but if you've never done business with those giant firms, predicting when is hard. But here's what I'll never forget. I was extremely well thought of and popular in that company. John and I had an unbelievable relationship. Not a single person called me when I missed or when they went to club. And I'll never forget the pain of that. Everybody calls. So let me talk about inspiration for a minute, because this is a concept that is absolutely fundamental to me. Everybody here needs inspiration. You don't need it all the time. The time it's needed the most is when it's offered the least. The time it's needed the least is when it's offered the most. If you win, everybody calls you. How does that feel after a few calls? That's not inspiration. I believe if someone's doing everything they can and they're the right person and they're really killing themselves for your company and you know how disappointed they are, that's the moment you give them a call. In our company, we call it catch someone doing something right. I started that 19 years ago. Very simply put, if you see somebody do something extraordinary to help a customer, to help society, to help NetApp, and then I evolved it to, if you have somebody that needs a lift, they're doing all the right things. And today, about 70% of my calls are those kind of calls. And it started in 1985 because no one called me. And from that moment on, I looked for those people. In every organization I led, I said, I'm not going to let that happen to you, what happened to me. I left Stratus in I told the CEO I was leaving in 1989, basically because John had left for Cisco, and the CEO was wealthy and not working the way I thought he should, and now we were settling. A few years later, they got bought by AT&T. And I went to them and said, I'm going to leave. And they were shocked. I had been promoted. And I had put on my reviews that I would like to go to Stanford sometime for their executive leadership program, 6 weeks. And he said to me, we don't want you to leave. They came to me later. We got you. You're in Stanford. When you come out, if you're not happy, we get it. Turns out that like 60% of people who go to these Stanford or Harvard courses either get divorced or quit their jobs when they come out. Just saying. So it has to do with the first time you're out of your job and you have time to think. But he probably assumed I wasn't coming back, but they wanted to buy time. But something else happened there that changed my life, and I'd like to share that with you. I read a case study that was done at Yale on high-performance people. Most high-performance people have time-bound measurable goals, written goals. Yet, less than 10% of people, therefore, their belief, have time-bound measurable goals. I thought about that. I didn't. People say, how you doing? Yeah, I'm doing well. Against what? But I decided I would do something about it right then. It changed my life. There's a Forbes.com article on this that's got quite a bit of play if you're interested, but let me just take you through it quickly. 2 examples. Rob Salmon runs worldwide sales for NetApp today. He was our original salesman. He's one of 4 people who have been at NetApp longer than me. From carrying the original bag, he's running a $7 billion number. No one in Silicon Valley has made that climb before. Rob can show you what I'm about to tell you, he can show you from when I first had that talk with him in 1994, excuse me, 94. Guy who used to run Asia for us, he's now a COO of his own company because he wanted to move back to Australia. Came from a first-year sales guy up to running a $700 million company. He can show you our first conversation, what his goals were. So here's what I did. I came up with a system I followed religiously for a very long time, and it paid off extraordinarily well for me. And here's what I did: 90-day goals. Now, why 90-day goals? I started out with 6-month goals and nothing for 90 days. So, okay, 90-day goals. 90-day goals are long enough that you better do something now to get there. If I do a year goal, 2-year goal, 5-year goals, it's not going to impact my behavior for a long time. I want something that's going to make me react to it almost instantaneously. So I set 3 personal goals every 90 days. Now, how do you set that goal? I asked myself a simple question. If I do what, do I feel good about me? My dad got very ill, had Alzheimer's toward the end, and it was very difficult to talk to him. And I found myself not wanting to talk to him, not wanting to talk to him on the phone because he wouldn't talk back. One of my goals became, I'm going to call my father every week and I'm going to spend 30 minutes on the phone. I said I'm going to talk to him because there was no talking. And when he passed, that meant a lot to me. I don't know. Now, on personal goals, I don't normally share them, and I don't share them as I'm doing them. Because here's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to raise my aspirations. What I realized as I was going through this is like most people, when I think of greatness, I wasn't thinking of me. If you ask me about greatness, I think about other people. I had a one-on-one with Shimon Peres for 45 minutes in Israel. And I said to him, what's the single biggest challenge you have in Israel? He said, taking every 8-year-old and within 6 months, having them believe they can do everything their parents told them they couldn't. So you have to, how do you raise your own expectations of yourself? This goal system did it for me. So I set 3 things in place that if I do them over the next 90 days, I'm going to feel good about me. It has to be measurable. So I'm going to be a nice person, it's not a measure. I'm going to lose weight, it's not a measure. I'm going to lose 10 pounds, and you pick what it is. Then I put it away. And again, I don't share that, but professionally, I take 3 things that I'm going to do to make an impact on the business every 90 days. And then I talk to my client. So let's say when I was president of NetApp, that would have been Rob Sem. And I would say, Rob, in the next 90 days, I'm going to do these 3 things. Those are sitting there. I remember one of them, I was going to go to China to help. And he said, I wouldn't do that. We have enough guys. I said, what would you like me to do? He said, could you pick 5 cities you haven't been to that much, go do an event? One of them was yours. We came up north to do it. It's fantastic. But the point of that is, now I'm aligned with my client. If I do these 3 things, I'm going to make an impact on the business. I haven't put any energy in. And then there's only 2 steps. Let it sit for a day, and then read it, line by line. And as you do, say, if I do that, will I be proud of myself? What an epiphany it was for me. Hayes was nice enough to say that I live my life trying to help other people. There's a downside to that. The downside to that is, what are you trying to shoot for? Where are you trying to go? So I said to myself, making myself proud of me is more important than making somebody else proud of me. And so let's say you said 30 minutes on a treadmill, and you moved it to 35. I wouldn't go to like 4 hours, 7 days a week. You know you won't do it. But those 5 minutes will change your life. And it changed my life as I started to break through barriers that I had put in front of me. I didn't even realize it. I was able to change people's perceptions of me. He's just a sales guy. Well, what does that mean? I figured out what it meant. I put goals around, I'm going to make them think differently of me by showing things. And I changed perceptions, and people started to give me much more responsibility very quickly. The second step, I said there were 2 steps, is you got to put it in your diary, whatever you use, your planner, as an appointment with yourself you will not break. Now, of course, there's nothing that you won't break if it's your family or an emergency, but how many times have you said something, this is important to me, I'm going to do it, somebody calls, can you meet me at the office at 7:30? Sure. You didn't ask why, you're trying to be responsive. I've also found as a leader, if you're not always accessible, a lot of times they figure it out themselves. It's not always great to fix the problem for them. But that goal system has helped me transform and raise my expectations. My next job is a place called Auspex, got me in the storage world. Met Dave Hitz and James Lau, founded NetApp. They were the original geniuses there. Had a 3-year run there where I ran North American sales. And we did a lot of things right. We realized the power of inside sales. I was able to set up the entire sales team for the first time in North America. Previously, it had already been set up when I took over. It's my first chance to actually bring a team together. Everywhere I had been, the cultures look a lot like what I believe NetApp became. But above me, I had to buffer them from that. The companies didn't have that culture. My group had a culture, which unfortunately is true of most big companies. But I wanted a chance to create a culture. And then I realized that the CEO did not really respect sales whatsoever. He told me one day, I replaced the VP of sales, and once we went public, I heard him say to somebody else, she said, oh, Tom's done a great job, him and his team. He said, anybody could sell this product. I had worked for engineers over and over again. That's why when Mortgage left Stratus, now I'm working directly for an engineer again. They never seem to get the skill and the art of customer and client relations and the pain you have to go through to get it. And I wanted someone who respected that. And then came NetApp. When I got to NetApp, it's kind of a crazy job to take because we had 10 months left. We were 600 grand on a $16 million number. A friend of mine was a VC, said, would you go look at this deal? His TA Associates. I sent them back my analysis. You're fucked. Anyway, that's what I said, so I'm just saying. I thought that was succinct. And he said, could you flesh that out for me? He put $1 million into it. And then, basically, the original NetApp plan was a going out of business plan being executed just brilliantly. They had, the end user paid 50 grand per device for a network appliance, as it was called. NetApp, or network appliance, only got 12 grand of that. The rest went to the partner. Partner could put whatever parts they want in it. Any disk drive, any memory. How do you think that worked from a quality point of view? And we're going to be the data holder of the companies, right? So, and they always thought low end. They would say everybody should have one. I'm not that kind of guy. I like to sell to people. A few people have a lot. So from every model, there's no way just from a sales place, you couldn't get there from here. They called me the next day and said, would you take over sales? I'm like, Jesus. Long story short, best decision I ever made. Dave and James are incredible founders. And when Dan Warmenhoven joined us 6 months ago, 6 months later, we set off on a journey. So we made that first year, which was incredibly hard. One of the things I did right, I went to a headhunter. I said, I got to hire 8 people. I figured out the average sales price of the product, how many I have to sell, how many people I'd have to hire to get there. You can't miss on those hires. We had no window. We were 600 grand on a $16 million number with 10 months to go, and I had 3 salespeople. Not a good situation. So I needed to hire 8. I went to a search guy who was well known. I said, I'll give you 100% of my business, literally 100% for as long as you can handle it, on one condition. You fly to all the cities I need to hire in. You get 3 people to sit across the table from me. The first one that I don't hire because they're not qualified, you're fired. So as long as they're all qualified, I'll pick one. But if you can't, he dropped everything. He did that for me. Of the first 8 hires I made, I think 1 didn't stay 5 years, and that's because they went to another startup. But that was the basis of it. As you well know, how you start has a lot to do with how you finish in this kind of game. So we went 16, 43, 90, eventually became $1 billion, 6 years. We've been through the crisis, a couple crises, now we're $7 billion. Let me move on to the people who influenced me and how those feed into that and how that feeds into my thinking on culture. First gentleman I mentioned was John Morgridge. So what John did, he influenced me in a number of ways. Number one, he was supportive when it was tough. And I hadn't seen that before. My previous companies was all about numbers. If you're on a number, they're great. If you're not, you're gone. Nobody wanted to discuss the effort. Number two, he didn't let people define him. John graduated from the University of Wisconsin, then went to Stanford Business School. And in the 80s, CEOs were engineers. Silicon Valley and Boston. Don Valentine hired John Morgridge for Cisco. He told me the first non-engineer he ever put in that spot. 2 best hires he ever made were him and Dan Warmenhoven. But John, when we were at Stratus, he was told, you'll never be CEO. I was sitting in the room because you're not an engineer. He left on the spot. It looked like he had the best job in the world. He went to Grid, and then Don Valentine put him at Cisco in 1986. And here's the other key things he taught me. I met with him all the time when he first founded Cisco. The early 90s, he never lost his values. In the early 90s, there's a school in Palo Alto, was primarily black. Palo Alto was the murder capital of the year that year. And there was an article written about, you know, what can you expect out of these people? It's written in Northern California. And John was so offended that he went to that high school. They donated an enormous amount of gear. Him and his wife, Tasha, taught there. They assigned a full-time guy who was one of Cisco's better people to help the teachers learn how to teach technology. And it wasn't that long after 60 Minutes to the show on this incredible school. But the one condition John put on is they couldn't talk about it. They couldn't talk about him. They couldn't talk about Cisco. How different is that than how most people give? And at the end of the day, many years later, she did come out and talk about John. John is the biggest supporter of public education in Wisconsin, enormous amount of money. He also had the business school named after him at the University of Wisconsin. And I always said in my head, what an incredible thing to be able to do to give back to education. I was very fortunate in 2001, I got to endow the business school at Notre Dame. John was my speaker at that ceremony. The school's now been named the #1 business school in America for undergraduate the last 4 years. And I think I probably would never have had that idea, but he was my idea of what an executive should be, not just because he made money. He also taught me that you should watch your money. If any of you worked at Cisco, you know John was very cheap inside the company. I mean, you got to be careful how you spend your money. We don't like the mahogany desk stuff. NetApp doesn't run that way. But John had an amazing influence. And one day I was on a plane with him, by chance. I said, John, who are the 5 most important people in the success of Cisco? First person he says, Don Valentine. I went, Chairman of the board, you're most successful. That's the reason? He said, absolutely. He said, you can go out of business because you can't sell. You can go out of business because you sell too much too fast and you make mistakes. The wrong move at the wrong time in a startup will kill you every bit as fast as not growing. So when I joined NetApp, we didn't have our second round done. So I had to sell enough quickly that we would get the right VC to go, then hire the right CEO. This is not a strategy for success in general, though. That's not a guidance. So it happened, and we were about to close the round. We only had 2 days left of payroll. So we were very anxious to close the round. And I got a call from John Mortgage, and he said, Don Valentine is very interested in investing in NetApp. Now, I came from Auspex. Don Valentine's company was on that board. They were our direct competitor. To invest, they have to sell all their stock there to invest in NetApp. We're going to close the round. This was a Monday. We're going to close the round Wednesday at noon. So Donna once told me, I said to him, I don't think we should have that meeting. And John said, do you want to move to the East Coast? I live on the East Coast now. I didn't want to move to the East Coast then. He's like, if I call him back and said you won't meet, you probably should move to the East Coast. Oh, okay. So we agree we're going to have the meeting, but I'm not thinking Don's going to be our investor. I just don't want to piss him off. And we walk in the room. I'm with the acting CEO. We had 3 founders at NetApp. 2 are still with us to this day. The third was the acting CEO, but once we started to sell, started to think he was a good CEO type guy. We went into this meeting. As we were walking, he says, let me do all the talk. And I'm like, yeah. We get in the meeting. I said, I'd like to say a few words at the beginning. The guy looks at me. The guy's name is Mike. And Don and 12 VCs around the room. I said, I don't think we should have this meeting. Don goes, what a curious way to begin. I said, well, first of all, I know you're going to like what we have to say. And then what you're going to want to do is delay this so you can investigate. We got to close. Don goes, we understand the ground rules. We go through this meeting. I'm fine because I've already said what I have to say. At the end of the meeting, Don looks at me and goes, let me ask you one question. Can you beat Auspex? I said, you want the long or the short answers? He goes, short. I said, I quit there to come here. He said, okay. Next day, I fly home. I lived in Dallas, and my phone rings at my house. This is before you actually have a phone in your house. And he says that this guy who last couple of years voted VC of the year for Sequoia says to me, Don would like you to come back. If it's not a big inconvenience. I'm thinking, under what circumstance would that not be an inconvenience? He's calling me in Dallas. Anyway, get back on the plane because it is Don Valentine. And when I walked in the room, I'm thinking, what might he ask? Well, they didn't ask me about market. He says to me, should I fire the CEO and how fast should I do it? Pooh. The guy who hired me recently before. And I didn't know, I just said I'd love to keep the guy in. But what hit me about Don and the relationship he has is his feedback's immediate. It is the most unfiltered feedback you could possibly imagine. Most people don't like that. But every question's on point, and that actually saved our company. So we decided to take Don's investment. He was the 3rd highest investor, and John Mortgage said to me, Don's going to be your number 3 bid. I would take his money. And I went, first of all, I knew what the bids were. CEO of Cisco, why is he in the middle of this? Because Don Valentine thought this could be the next Cisco. That's what he said. He thought this could be the one. And he said to me, you should take his money as long as he's your chairman. Don did not want to be chairman of anything. He was chairman of Cisco. So that's the condition. We'll take your money. And Don Valentine being our chairman is one of the main reasons NetApp's a $7 billion company. His first board meeting, he walks in. Somebody had done NetApp napkins. He goes, NetApp napkins, what'd that cost? We never saw another NetApp napkin. That was it for that, right? So we got the idea there. The meeting's ending. Mike Malcolm, our CEO, puts on the agenda, we're going to end the CEO search. Before we get to item 1, Don goes, Mike, I don't know what you're doing the rest of your life. You're no longer CEO. What's next? It's like a 3-second conversation. These things tear companies apart because people don't want to address them. They take time addressing them. And then he hired Dan Warmanoven. Dan introduced Don to the Cisco investment when he was at Hewlett-Packard. There's some good play. And when Dan then became CEO of another company, the company took over. They found out they was stuffing stuff in closets and stuff before Dan got there, and he had a terrible experience for 3 years trying to save a company. Don loved the fact that he didn't run, and he tried to save it. And Don loved the fact, like with John, people did not believe in him. They didn't believe John could do it because he was a sales guy. They didn't believe Dan could be that guy because he didn't have this experience. Don loves that. So the first board meeting with Dan, first board meeting, we walk in, and Dan says to me right before he goes to present Dan says to me, can we have a 5-year forecast? We've been in business less than 1. So I write it up, my best view of 5 years, and Dan says to me, how confident are you in that forecast? I said, Dan, it's based upon people we haven't hired yet, selling to people they haven't met yet. Because would you do anything different? No, I wouldn't. That's how I figured it's going to go, and it went that way. We walk in, and Dan has to gives a plan for Don. This is our operating plan for the next year. Don doesn't even pick it up. Sits down, and he goes, are you asking for my opinion or my approval? Now, Dan, being a CEO, realized he just gave him a book that thick. Perhaps he should have given it before the meeting. Just a thought. So Dan, being quick, says, no, I'm just looking for your opinion. Great. So Don doesn't ever open the book. He just sits there. Dan's like this. We flip through these slides super fast. We're done. And Don says, are we done now? We're done. He says, let's go back to slide 19. Never seen the book. Never opened the book. They go back to slide 9. I'm looking at that and I'm going, what could he possibly see? I mean, it was just a P&L. It was a head count slide for 5 years or something like that. And he let it sit for a while, and he turns to the head of manufacturing. He goes, let me ask you a question. Are we a manufacturing company or a virtual manufacturing company? Anybody who asks you about the cost of the napkins, you know the virtual is the answer. You know what I'm saying? So he goes, virtual. He goes, that headcount slide for manufacturing shows 40 people, 70 people, 120, 500. The guy says, you just don't understand. He said, let's take a break. Fired the guy on the spot. Closed the door. He has me and Dan. He goes, have you read his resume? Oh. He goes, he has never set up a company where he didn't have less than 2,000 people working for him. Today, NetApp doesn't have 100 people in manufacturing. 20 years later, we'd have thousands. He did the same thing at Cisco. That's an example of a move that once you start that in play and you bring manufacturing in-house, you can't take it out. He stopped it on the spot. The last lesson that Don taught me, which 2 other things. One is he said to me, when I had to set up all the offices for NetApp worldwide. He goes to me, you'll probably screw this up like everybody else. But he's very motivational. But let me give you some advice. He goes, what everybody does wrong is he was using Cisco as an example. He said, they're like different companies in different countries or in different geos. He said, you don't want NetApp, you don't want a Japanese NetApp and a British NetApp and an Australian. You want NetApp in Japan, NetApp in Britain. You want to walk in an office and feel the culture. If you can do that, you can sustain through good and bad. Ladies and gentlemen, that is what we did. Today, if I go around the world and I walk in an office, and that's why I travel so much, so I can see it. We have the same core beliefs, and we're trying to execute the same program, but we start from a place with common beliefs. Those beliefs are very straightforward. Attitude, we're not hiring. If you don't have the right attitude, leave. If you think there's a better place for you and your family, go find it. But we're going to hire the attitude. Candor. Hayes talked about getting in a room. We believe that you can say whatever you want in a room, and you should say it, but if you say it when you're outside the room, we don't need you. We're going to solve it in the room. Third is a positive attitude. Catch someone doing something right. positive feedback to your employee base as opposed to a punitive one. The fourth is leadership. We want to reward leadership, not management. You manage things, you lead people. Core of leadership being aspiration and inspiration. Are we aspiring high enough? And what are you doing to inspire them to get there? And the last one is we have to embrace change, which is the core of Hayes' message. You're either getting better or you're getting worse. Don Valentine was my inspiration to drive that worldwide, and we did it. And then the final thing he taught me was a very painful lesson, but it imbued my leadership style from that moment forward. He told me early on, don't come to any more board meetings. You're rolling. We're just getting this thing going. At the beginning, it was hard. It was hard. And I was out, Cleveland, Ohio, and all these places in the middle of the night trying to help. I remember being on the phone with guys, and he said, it must kill you to come to Silicon Valley for this. We'll call you if we need you. I was like, so fast forward about a year, and we went, I get a phone call. Don Valentine would like you to present next board meeting. I'm like, yeah. I'm figuring, the old Roman thing with the armies and everybody celebrating and cheering. It's going to be unbelievable. So I come just ready to walk into the board meeting. Haven't been there in over a year. And my CFO gives me a slide he would like to start with. I have one slide. Goal, performance. That's it. Any sales guy that comes in with a lot of slides is not on their numbers. That's a fact. So I come walking in, I throw this thing down, I go, as you can see, we're doing well. And I want to get in, and Don goes, whoa. He goes, deferred revenue. What's in that? I go, the guy who gave me the slide, of course, there's no help at all. He's looking down, taking notes. I'm like, I'm not sure. He goes, you're not sure it's in deferred revenue? I said, no, I'm really not. I said, quite honestly, I didn't put the slide together. It's not my thing. I'm trying to sell stuff. You often put up stuff that you don't know what you're talking about? Like, what? He gave me a proctology exam that lasted for about 30 minutes on fucking deferred revenue. Not even the rest of the slide, just deferred revenue. And then he goes, we're out of time. I'm like, we're out of time. I flew in from New York for this. I'm like, that was it? So I come walking out. You mentioned you just met with Sequoia. You probably met with Doug Leone. Doug runs Sequoia today. Doug's a very good friend of mine. I come storming out of that meeting, ready to kill somebody, and Doug comes running out. He was a young Sequoia guy back then. And he says to me, Tom, you didn't like that meeting, did you? I said, Doug, that Stanford education was wasted on you. He goes, well, what do you think Don was doing? I have no fucking idea what Don was doing. He goes, well, let me tell you what Don was doing. He says, well, let me ask you a question. Last year wasn't going so well for you as a company. What was Don's attitude? He's very supportive. How you doing now? We're killing it. Don knows that. Don believes the number one killer of companies is complacency. And he's never going to let you get complacent. I believe when times are good, you have to inject tension. You have to lift. And when times are tough, you have to be supportive. And most companies do it exactly the opposite. Don taught me that. And then the final person that has influenced my career and is if you had to say why NetApp's NetApp, I believe there's a few people that people will point to, and Dan Warmenhoven would definitely be one. When Dan became CEO, I didn't interview Dan in the process. It was actually between Ed Zander, for those of you who know the game back then, who got the presidency of some by not taking our job. But it was between Ed Zander and Dan Warmenhoven. I knew Ed Zander. I went to my high school. I've known Ed for 15, 20 years. I didn't know Dan, but Dan got the job. And I get a phone call. I'm in Dallas, Texas. He says, Tom, this is Dan Warmenhoven. I'm your new CEO. I'm like, great. Glad somebody is. We need a CEO. And he says to me, are you a football fan? I said, yeah, I'm a football fan. He says, I'm going to make you my Emmitt Smith. I am going to give you the ball until you cannot run with it anymore. You tell me what you need, and I'm going to give it to you. Now, keep in mind, I worked for all engineering guys till then. By the way, Dan was the youngest vice president in IBM engineering ever. But he's not an engineer mentality. He's a we got to help sales mentality. We got to be client-oriented mentality. And it was like such a refreshing thing to me to know that somebody had my back. It wasn't just going to be about numbers. Then we had the forecast meeting. But the other epiphany, Dan, a lesson he taught me, which is useful to everybody here, and Trace 3 has done this extremely well. We were $43 million in revenue our second year. And we had an offsite. Dave Hitch, James Lau, me, Dan, and the rest of the people are retired now. And we said, what are we going to accomplish next 5 years? 5-year plan. Well, we wanted to pick 3 things. First thing we did, we said we are going to create a market segment that will be measured by Gartner Group. That's very unusual. Most people find a segment and fit into it. That became network attached storage. As an aside, we came up with the term network attached storage in that meeting. Dan put up all the file server companies, FileNet, I forget, they all went out of business. Together, they weren't a $20 stock. And then he put up all the network guys, and they had these huge PEs. He goes, we're a network something. So network attached storage, very, very technical discussion. That's where that came from. The second thing is we're going to dominate that segment. I like that, dominate. And then the third thing, and I swear to God I was in men's room when this happened, I come walking back in and says, $1 billion, and they're all cheering. I'm going, $1 billion? We were $43 million. Dave Hitz goes, you know, if you double every year, it's actually like 1.12. I'm like, that's your bottoms-up plan. So as a sales guy, I figured, you know, work a year or two, update your resume, and here we go again. Well, we did 90 million. By the way, there's no backing off the plan. The saying in the company was double or die. Double or die. And the reasoning was, if we don't take this share, someone else will. You don't always have open windows. If you don't take them, somebody else will. And once they close, history's been written on your company. We got to go. When you see an opportunity, you got to take it. So we were 90, 150, 250. Outside the company, stock was doing great. We had gone public, big offering. Inside, it was a disaster. What do we got to do? What do we got to do? Then we did 500 and $1 billion. If we had set that number at 600 million, we'd have done 600 million. Guarantee you. And what Dan taught me a lesson which I never forgot, and there's a reason we continue to grow, and there's a reason we continue to do what we've done, is you have to aspire to great things. You have to be realistic. You have to explain how you're going to get there. People want to work for someone aspiring. Why is Hayes' talk exciting? He's aspiring to do great things. If you are not aspirational, if your mission's not aspirational, if it doesn't relate down to what does it mean to me, why should I sacrifice for you? All leadership's about, will you sacrifice for me? That's why I believe as a leader, you have to go make an impact at the point of attack, and you travel, do whatever you got to do. Such that when you ask back, they'll do it because they don't want to let you down. Let me just close on a personal note. I don't really talk about this stuff, but have you ever wondered what moment of your life, if somebody said to you, give me the moment that's the most satisfying moment of your life, single satisfying moment. I was asked that question. I'm going to speak at North Carolina State for the Fidelity Leadership Series next month. And I spoke there a few years ago, and a student asked me that. Should I share this because you're all family people and you've all done some cool things? Let's share the moment that I related. So when in the mid-90s, my mother passed suddenly. We didn't see that coming. She was the healthy one. We always thought my dad would go, but when she did, I called Notre Dame and I said, I'd like to endow a 4-year scholarship forever for some student in my father's name. I want my father's name on something. And I said, there's 3 conditions to that scholarship. Number 1, I don't care if it's man, woman, black, white. You pick whoever it is, but they got to be qualified to go to Notre Dame. Number 2, it's got to be their dream. So if you say, well, they say, I'll consider it, you don't do that. And the third one is they got to write my father a letter every semester. So my father, at the end of his life, next to his bed with his stack of letters. So he got these letters. So fast forward 5 years later, so that's a pretty good deal. So from 1995 to now, forever, some kid's getting a 4-year scholarship every year. And Ty, my fiance, is here. We still get the letters, so they're still writing. But 5 years later, I endowed the business school at Notre Dame. And I brought my dad, and he had, that condition where you can't be in crowds. I forget what you call, you know what I'm saying. Later on in life, he got that weird feeling we had in the crowds. This is kind of an odd thing, and he's like, I'm not sure I can go. I go, Dad, you got to be there. He's the only parent, Mom. So they did a thing in the auditorium. Dan Warmanover was there. Warren Buffett, he was there because we were playing Nebraska. Jack Welch and Condoleezza Rice and Larry Bossidy were in the front row. And my dad, at the beginning of the day, met the people who had the scholarships in his name. And he kept saying, oh, they're going to want to meet you. They're going to want to meet you. They didn't want to meet me. They wanted to meet him, and they wanted to talk. They brought their dads and their World War II stuff. So that was great. But then we go to this auditorium. And to describe the vibe, they're putting a name on the business school right after. You know, they just put the name up, and we're in the auditorium, Mendoza College of Business. And my dad has a sixth grade education, so it's hard to describe how this felt to him. But he said, you can't bring me up, but he wanted to watch. He's watching on the side. Now, I was the final speaker, and I said, 3 things happen to yourself in life you should consider yourself fortunate. Number 1, you live in a country this can happen to you. All of us have to realize that if we were born in Afghanistan, this thing would have played out very, very differently. So we got to treasure the fact that we live here. Number 2, if you have parents who tell you you can. I didn't come from any money. I didn't come from any of that. Neither parent went to high school. But they always made me believe I could. It's the single biggest gift you can give somebody is belief. And then finally, I said, if you have somebody in your life that wakes up with your interests at heart every day, I'm very fortunate to have that with Ty now, and you feel the same way about them, so you give them more than that. But I said, let me give you one for today only. Can you imagine being the father whose son's name just went up, or his name's on side? And I said, I got to bring my dad up here. He didn't want to come up, but they brought him up. And that crowd stood and cried and cheered for probably 10 minutes. If you stand on stage for 10 minutes and an audience close to the side stands, it's almost overwhelming. And what struck me then, though, all this work that we do is meant so that you can make a lasting impact. We'll be judged not by what we take or make. We'll be judged by what we give. And I've been very, very fortunate to be in a position to give. Thank you for your time. Hayes, I appreciate the opportunity to speak today. Take care.